Mr. Neino, first, accept our thanks for the quick thinking that allowed the kill switch to prevent so many infections. But with regard to your measurements, however, you suggest that the number of 200,000 infections is too low, and that before the implementation of the kill switch, there may have been 1 to 2 million infections. In that regard, how do you then explain that practically no one tried to pay the ransom, if there were that many more?
I think there were some who tried to pay the ransom, be it the measure of success of that is hard to determine. I think we also...
What you've got is that from many studies that a large portion of the companies do pay the ransoms when their computers are encrypted, but by monitoring the Bitcoin while it's advertised in the WannaCry malware, it seems that less than 500 people did so. That's 0.02 of 1%.
Sure. Well, I think
that's very inconsistent.
Yeah,
with what you're saying.
I think that when you look at, it's hard to associate the payments to the actual spread, and I'll tell you for a variety of reasons. One, when you look at the actual attack and the magnitude of the attack, and then you try to trace it to the payment, if you look at the mechanisms to make the payment, it was one, not clear whether you would get your systems back anyways. And at this point, the attacks have been abandoned. So we know that if you paid the ransom, you didn't go anywhere. Most of the media and many of the experts were suggesting not to pay the attack. We were asked the same question, and we said you would have to base your own risk organization and determine if you should pay the attack. However, what I can say is the data that we are receiving is absolute. When we get this data, we've been doing this. It's not just WannaCry. We've been doing this for close to a decade. We see and visibly analyze data that comes in. It is accurate.
I'd like to address this question to General Touhill, and again, as many of our members have said, thank you for your service, sir. Your testimony refers to people who were infected by running Windows 95, but published industry reports are saying that almost everyone that was infected was running Windows 7. So isn't it true that the main reason people were infected was because an intelligence community vulnerability was leaked to the public? Turn on your mic, please.
Yeah, thanks. Sir, thanks for the question. Just for clarity's sake, in my written testimony, I highlighted Windows 95 as being used as an exemplar. However, there was plenty of other different operating systems that were very susceptible to this type of attack, including Windows ME, 7, a lot of unpatched systems.
But I'm asking about an intelligence community vulnerability that was leaked to the public.
I think that if we take a look at it from that standpoint, yeah, I'm very concerned about that, and I think that this highlights a couple of things. First of all, patch your systems. We've been telling you all along to do that. Second of all, I think that as we take a look at the leakage of information or the attribution of leakage of information, that's very serious and unacceptable.
Well, in regard to the patch, the reality is that a team of hackers calling themselves shadow brokers published an NSA exploit called Eternal Blue on the internet, and that happened in January 2017, and Microsoft released a patch that addressed that vulnerability 3 months later, in March. The patch was called MS17-010, so it was not a problem of machines being out of date. The problem was that if you hadn't put all of the Microsoft recommended patches on, all of the machines within 60 days, you would become a victim. And it was a 0-day attack because when Eternal Blue code was released in January, there was no way to protect a computer from it.
I don't know if I don't believe I would characterize this one necessarily as a full 0-day attack. From my perch, frankly, because the fact that we had some patches that had been put out, and Microsoft went through extraordinary measures, by the way, to go out and create those patches for operating systems that had previously been declared unsupportable many years before. And I used Windows 95 in my written testimony as an exemplar because Windows 95 had been online for about 19 years before it was retired. Mm-hmm. And for the last 3 years, Microsoft had not been supporting it. And then for them to come back and put out that patch in March was extraordinary. And through a federal government and other organizations around the world, we went out and we clearly communicated, and Carnegie Mellon's CSIRT was one of them. clearly communicated to all of the communities of interest, patch your systems. This is an important patch. And it was
Right.
labeled as a critical patch, sir.
If I may, I have one more question for Mr. Thompson. Could you address the double pulsar feature that you mentioned? Since no one was actually paying the ransom, is it possible, but the real goal of the attack was to allow remote access to the machines that the double pulsar was installed on by becoming infected?
Thanks for your question. It's difficult to anticipate what the true intention was of this attack, whether it was ransomware, whether it was a test, whether it was the ability to propagate some kind of backdoor. But what is, I think, interesting as a characteristic of the attack, which I think goes back to your first question of why didn't we see, quote, normal or expected rates of ransomware payment, the back-end infrastructure that was set up was very weak compared to the typical piece of ransomware that we see out there in the wild. And it is pretty incredible. Many of these ransomware attacks have a very robust infrastructure behind them. They have almost the equivalent of customer support for people that have been infected with the ransomware. We didn't see that level of sophistication here in the back end.
I thank the witnesses for their answers. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer.